We have been studying Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Kena Upanishad and are now at a point which, on our own, we would have found somewhat technical and not so obvious. Sri Aurobindo, through a series of steps, brings us to the deeper recognition of what the Upanishad is leading us to, both in our understanding and in our experience in the higher layers of our consciousness. In the text of the Kena, it starts by showing us how to get to the realization of the divine. And it starts by saying that you cannot get it through the thought. And if you think you know it, then you know very little of it. And the means to get to it is to turn our attention to that of it which is you and that of it which is in the gods. You can not know that directly, but you can know the part of that which leans into you. You can know the way the divine represents himself to you in your consciousness, in your awareness, and in two different directions. One is turning inwards, the other is turning outwards. In both cases, we do not stop with the immediate appearance, but we have to look behind the physical form, behind the form of life energy, behind even the mental form. So turning inwards, this means disengaging from our body identification, disengaging from the identification with our life impulses, and even stepping back from our thoughts, and recognizing that which is most essential, which makes our awareness us. And you will recognize immediately the path of the Jnana Yoga through our dwelling inwards in who is that which is I. At the same time, there is a turning outward to look behind the appearances of things in the universe, to get to that which is most essential, which makes the things themselves. And this can be done with different objects. You begin with the flower, you dwell on the tree, the ocean, the mountain, and to something more general, you look at the sky, you look at the entire universe in your conception, and then try to perceive that which is most essential, which makes it whole, it real. And in this way, one approaches that divine consciousness by the means which is most accessible to us. As that contact grows, as that contact deepens, we have the sense of being close to it. Now, in the text itself, although the vocabulary uses the manyase, that is in the mind, thinking, knowing, the deeper meaning of this term would include all that comes within our mental awareness. It includes our emotions. It includes the turn of the heart to the divine also, although that is not made explicit in the nature of the text, because in the period in which the Kena Upanishad was given form, the approach of the heart as a separate and a special relationship with the divine had not been developed in the way that it took place later on, and especially with the particular form given to it by the divine manifestation that we know as Sri Krishna. But essentially, that whole approach of the bhakti, of the heart's self-giving, is included in this. And so when the mind dwells in this sense on the divine and that which is essential, the heart also can join and bring into it a deep completeness and intimacy of delight. In the paragraph we had read last time, Sri Aurobindo puts the various elements of this experience in relation to each other, because the Kena Upanishad has also termed that which is essential in the working in the universe as that which is in the gods. And so the role of the gods as cosmic powers, the role of ourself in relation to the gods, and the relationship of both ourself and the gods with the divine. These Sri Aurobindo encapsulates in a description which goes like this. We had read it last time, but now we will dwell on it a little more and capture the fullness of what it conveys. Just as the gods govern, supported by ourself, the cosmos of our individual being, the action of our mind, senses, and life, so the Lord governs as mind of the mind, sense of the sense, life of the life, supporting his activity, supporting his active divinity by his silent, essential self-being, all cosmos and all form of being. So first, briefly, looking at this aspect of the relationship of the gods and the divine as Lord governs mind of our mind, that is, the divine cosmic creative consciousness, the supramental, which forms the universal mind, in which and of which the gods are the deities who rule, and through them the divine works in the universe. And the same with the sense of the sense, life of the life. So he, from behind, supports the working of the gods in the universal consciousness, in the universe. We are, like separate individuals, a special focus of the universe in which our self organizes this individuality, opens it out, and the gods work in us equally as they work in the universe. Behind the gods working is still the divine. But the God's working is not life of our life and mind of our mind. It is the divine behind which is. And so, not only in the perspective of the universe do we see the divine standing behind the working of the gods in the universe, but within ourselves, as we turn within, our individual self, the little self, offers a point, a center of focus. The gods work in this little movement, which is a representation of the whole cosmos. So Sri Aurobindo uses this word, cosmos of our individual being, because everything is here. And the gods are working within us as much as in the whole of the cosmos. And within us, our little self offers a point of support to organize our little individual cosmos, in which and for the development of which the gods are working. But behind them all is still the divine. And so for us to recognize ourselves, to recognize the gods as the two things which are essential is the first step. And then we have to see what is behind them. And behind them always it is the same one divine, within us experienced as self, through the gods experienced as the Lord. And the self and the Lord we find are the same one divine, towards whom our mind, our hearts turn in a joyous self-giving. This passage is the normal evolutionary process. Later on in the same chapter, Sri Aurobindo explains how it is possible to go directly to that which is the transcendent divine consciousness standing behind all this, but that is bypassing the evolutionary process, and it leaves a gap, a gulf, by which we do not know the form and the play, the manifestation of the divine in the universe and in us. And so the proper evolutionary process is in this way, from within inwards to self, turning, deepening in our perception to the Lord. And through the self and through the Lord, we attain to the divine in his highest poise, Parabrahman, transcendent, universal, and individual at the same time. So this is the picture he places before us. Now this is very briefly stated as a picture. It is a little complex perhaps, but the implications are extraordinary, and we will dwell upon it a little before we move on, because it has enormous value not only for our understanding of our relationship with the universe, but also of the nature of the yoga and the possibilities for the future of evolution. We recognize that the same gods who are working in the universe are working in us. And so we can see them as cosmic powers working. When there is thunder and lightning, we can say, this is one of the workings of Indra. But at the same time, if we turn within our own consciousness, and there is the thunder and lightning or the equivalent power working in us, it is also the same Indra. And so we can know Indra in ourselves, or rather in his working in ourselves, and there enter into relationship with that cosmic power which is operating outside. Now this particular line of development opens up extraordinary possibilities which are part of the certain systems of yoga, where to enter in relation with the cosmic powers, the gods within us, is the means by which we acquire a relationship with them in the cosmos. And when this is made the means of the sadhana, we find very quickly, as we develop within ourselves awakening to the divine working, we find ourselves capable of acting upon or influencing the divine working because of the relationship with the gods. It is not the divine himself, but his workings through the gods. We discover not only that we can ask for help from the gods and say, well, we need the rains to pause for the purpose of this work, for this duration, and they may comply. If we grow in mastery sufficiently that we are almost one in our working with their working, then it is not even a relationship of asking, it is a relationship simply to turn and to wish to have, and the action takes place. At the same time, one could have taken a different path. Instead of turning within, we turn to the gods outside us. We seek to propitiate them. We seek to enter in relation with them. We make this havana, yajna, as a ritual of fire, invoking Indra, invoking his help, making a special request, or developing through that ritual, through that external form, a relationship with that cosmic working. And then, through an external process, we acquire a similar relationship and a capacity to influence circumstances. It may not necessarily change us from within, though. It may not necessarily awaken that deeper possibility in us unless we choose to. So there's a path which begins inward primarily with its implications outward. And there's another path which begins by engaging externally first, and with the option to also develop within, which if you do not exercise, it is very easy to acquire great power, but with a consciousness which is still undeveloped, not gone beyond its personal ego. And we have many examples of such beings in the history of yoga all over the world. On the other hand, the inward path taken first, and the relationship with the outside felt naturally, spontaneously, one may or may not exercise that capacity externally because one may find it simply unnecessary or a distraction, or only exercise it when one is impelled by deeper intuition or inspiration to act. And we see examples of these also among many yogis. Sri Aurobindo, in one of his aphorisms, says something like this, that great yogis, I'm paraphrasing, great yogis have criticized miracles as the distraction. Greater yogis have performed miracles, but the greatest are those who have both criticized them and performed them. The idea being, they live in a consciousness in which the utility of miracles or these extraordinary interventions of this kind is seen to be in its proper place as irrelevant for the spiritual growth. And yet, when necessary, the intervention is applied as required, equally. And this is the direction in which one can take the inner journey. But in both of these approaches, the first relationship we set is with the working of the gods within us or in the universe. But if behind the working of the gods and behind ourself is the divine himself, and if we recognize that the gods themselves and their working are his working, and if we recognize that his working is through his power of manifestation, his Shakti, then we can relate directly also to his Shakti. We can relate to her in her specific working in us, to her working in the universe, or if we recognize that the working of the Shakti begins all the way from the Supreme, where it is himself moving to manifest, all the way down to even the lesser working of the nature, in which the divine Shakti as if hides behind the screen of mechanical working, unconscious working. If we know it is she always behind all the way to the Supreme, then we can consciously open to her. And then in her working, all the gods, and of all the gods, is included. In her working, all the powers of the gods are included. But because the relationship is with her directly, all their working is always spontaneous and in perfect harmony with each other. One does not have to pass through a series of relationships to be developed and deepened with each of the gods. And so this becomes the nature of the practice in the integral yoga. The big process of relating to the gods and through the gods and their powers is included, not explicitly focused upon. It is the working of the Divine Mother on all these different levels, in all these different facets and forms which we look at, where it is always her, the one to whom we relate. So this is one important insight which comes in this larger picture. Another important insight is, because it is the same working of the gods in the universe and within us, we carry within us all the possibilities of the universe. And if we carry those possibilities within, then their working out, their emergence, and their full expression is inevitable in evolution. And so this points to something extraordinary for the future, the full scope of which is so beyond our conception that even to speak of it appears to be too much of a fantasy. But it takes broadly this direction, that as our consciousness grows into its full possibility of divinity, as the divine through all the parts of our being, it is the omniscience of the divine expressing through the mind, the omnipotence of the divine expressing through the life energies. It is the harmony and beauty of the divine expressed through the form of the body, and the love and the bliss of the divine expressed through our inmost soul and psychic being. We become as if vehicles for the manifestation of all the possibilities of the cosmos consciously. From the scientific perspective, when we look at the universe as a big bang manifesting all these possibilities and then gradually unfolding, developing, and evolving, all of this has the sense of something unconscious, mechanical. But when in the individual being within us, the divine manifests in this way, entirely revealed, each one of us becomes as if a focal point for all the possibilities of the Big Bang to emerge. Not in one gigantic, chaotic explosion, but in a series of conscious manifestations, drawing out possibilities as if miraculously. But there is no miracle here, because it is the spontaneous and free working of the divine in us and through us in the universe. And so drawing out possibilities, creating, manifesting, reshaping the universe as the divine wills, but in ways that to us now seem to be impossible or magical, or at best a fantasy of science fiction. What we see in terms of spontaneous miracles that take place around great beings, yogis, or avatars, would be not only the norm, but its action would be spontaneous, constant, and in all things, including material objects. For example, when nature has had to struggle through a long process over millions of years to create a beautiful flower, which expresses a very special quality of the divine consciousness, It would be possible for such a divine being to directly draw out of himself from his own consciousness to express or to create that beautiful flower, to give it a material, physical form, to give it a place in the world spontaneously without having to pass through that long physical evolutionary process. Now, if you look at the logic of the evolution, this seems obvious. Look at how the human creativity expresses in its highest today. An artist conceives of and paints a beautiful flower, either by an imitation of what is in nature or drawing from within his own artistic imagination or inspiration a new flower which does not yet express, does not yet exist in nature. You see glimpses of some of these extraordinary scenes in certain movies, such as in Avatar, where a whole world is created where the plants are semi conscious, glowing with light, and able to engage with human beings, almost like conscious beings. Beautifully created. The imagination of the artist is in fact inspired by glimpses of things in the subtle worlds. In fact, all physical evolution in material nature is only trying to recreate in physical form and substance the things which already exist in the subtler worlds, in the subtle physical domains, in the vital domains, in the mental domains. And all of the best of human art is also glimpsing things of those domains and giving them form. And if this is the nature of the mental being's artistic expression, you only have to take one more step to the supramental being's artistic expression, which is to draw that which is already expressed in the higher diviner grades and bring it out into physical material form. And so the nature of the creative expression will be literally to bring into matter the things which are so far concealed in the divine possibilities, from the intermediate levels all the way to the highest. Things which we cannot yet imagine because they have not yet poured out of the divine even into the mental worlds and the vital worlds. And this is possible because we are a miniature universe. The difference between us and the rest of the universe is that we are part of a conscious evolution, a rapid and a focal point for the universe itself in its larger evolution. So this is one of the implications of this. And the meaning for this of the working of the gods in us is, for them, this is the single most important focus of their working. And therefore, you will recall Sri Aurobindo mentioning, and this is the text which we had read earlier, Sri Aurobindo speaks of how it is in us, in the mind, life, senses, and speech of man, that the battle between the gods and the anti-divine energies reaches its height and approaches to its full meaning. And so in the Vedic conception, each one of us is the battleground of the gods and the titans, even as the universe is the battleground for the gods and the titans. But within each one of us is the prized possession, the human soul, and the conscious possibilities which come with it are the prized possession in the battle. And so all the symbols of the Veda, which are descriptions for the cosmic working, are equally applicable outside us as within us. And the text of the Kena Upanishad is helping us now, those who seek to make that conscious choice, to align rapidly and find our link with the divine existence, which the gods are working to manifest in the cosmos. So now we come to the last implication of this perspective. With or without our conscious awareness, the gods are active, helping us to awaken. Even as the Titans, the Asuras, are active to distract us or deviate us from the straight path. With or without our choice, the divine presides over this whole working, and therefore, our eventual realization of the divine potential is inevitable. Nothing can shake from that destiny. But with our conscious acceptance, all of this can take place rapidly. And as we turn indwelling within us to that of the divine which is in us, which is us, and that of the divine which is in the gods, by turning in that direction, all of this becomes natural, accelerated. So, this is the implication of this picture, and you see how it changes completely our relationship with the universe, our relationship with the gods, and we understand how all of these things relate to the divine consciousness. So, our mind now is our point of contact, turning to the divine, dwelling upon this, and then he says, when we go behind ourself and the gods and find the one supreme self and the one supreme Godhead, then we can say, I think that I know. But after that, we have to understand that all that we know in this way is only a beginning. And there is something beyond this knowing of which the mind is not capable of, into which we have now to enter. So, if we fancy that we have grasped the Brahman by the mind, and in that delusion fix down our knowledge of him to the terms our mentality has found, then our knowledge is no knowledge. It is the little knowledge that turns to falsehood. And you will see this powerfully in the brief deviation in the long history of evolution that took place in what will be described as an ascetic spirituality. In the first turning of the experience of the mind and the heart to the divine, we glimpse the divine immensity, the divine knowledge, the divine beauty, and everything which is divine, against which now all of our human existence seems to be so superficial, unreal, transitory, unstable. And therefore we could very quickly come to the conclusion that therefore this is illusion or dream or domain of suffering to be abandoned. And only that is to be found. And so a first glimpse showed us something of the divine, but not yet the fullness of the divine. And very quickly then, that truth, and a profound truth, can turn into falsehood. It becomes false when you say, therefore the world is not divine. And that is a premature, hasty conclusion. Why? Because the first glimpse gave us an idea. We caught an aspect of the divine and we said, this is it, this is all. And we stopped there. So he says, so too, those who try to fix him into our notion of the fundamental ideas in which we discern him by the thought that rises above ordinary mental perception, have no real discernment of the Brahman, since they take certain idea symbols for the reality. So we take certain ideas, certain symbols, certain ways in which we know the divine and say, this is it, this is all, this is the divine. And again, we make an error. What are the various kinds of idea symbols? The idea symbol of infinity. The divine as something which is infinite. Or the sense of infinity taking the form of knowledge or the form of power, an infinite knowledge, omniscience, an infinite power, omnipotence. That is what the divine is. And now suppose you were to stop only with that and say the divine is all power. And you look at us and look at things in the universe and say this is not all power. This is not divine. And then what is the relationship of that all power to this universe? Well, it is sitting there. It is not working in the universe. And you would conclude that the divine is separate from the universe and does not interest himself in the universe. If the divine is all powerful, why does he allow all this suffering to take place? Then either he is not powerful or he is very mean. And this becomes a natural conclusion because we stopped with that one aspect. If we say the divine is all perfection, and all our efforts in life to achieve perfection fail, then we can only conclude that this substance of matter is unable to be perfect, does not therefore belong to the divine, and must be rejected. And so on. You can see how any partial recognition, glimpse of the divine, and stopping with that partial glimpse would lead to a great falsehood. In the text we saw earlier, Sri Aurobindo describes how the divine supports all of this working in the universe and all forms of being, supporting his active divinity by his silent, essential self-being. So divine has both aspects, the silence out of which all his action emerges and flows. And in that active being, and through that active being, he manifests all this universe. And so we must know him in his silence and in his active being, because he is both. And so the focus of this text is to know him entirely. In his working in the gods and through the gods, in his working in and through ourself, and all the rest that follows. So, on the other hand, if we recognize that our mental perceptions are simply so many clues by which we can rise beyond mental perception, and if we use these fundamental idea symbols and the arrangement of them with which our uttermost thought makes, in order to go beyond the symbol to that reality, then we have rightly used mind and the higher discernment for their supreme purpose. And so here we understand the true role that our mind has to play. Our mind, first in its evolution, turned to the senses, and through the senses tried to organize our life. In the higher phase of our evolution, our mind turned to higher ideals, to dream of an ideal life, an ideal society, an ideal knowledge, an ideal beauty, love, perfection. And in all these, it touched the symbols through which the divine reveals itself to our mind. Now we could catch those symbols and say this is all. Then you have this gap because the world cannot keep up with the ideal. Or we can say the symbols are the gateways through which we will know something even beyond the symbols, but by a means which is also beyond our mind. So our mind in its rarefied and highest development can rise to touch the symbols, and that's the level to which the divine leans to meet our mind's knowledge. And after that, we pass through the symbols into a higher grade of cognition, a higher way of knowledge, in which we can know the divine intimately, directly. And so it's as if these symbols, which our mind can touch in their highest, are the divine leaning down with his hands, reaching out to grasp our fingers as we reach up to our highest mental awareness. And the two meet at this juncture, at the point where these symbols exist. And after this, he pulls us up beyond the mind into a higher power of knowledge. And there we can know him entirely. So if we recognize that our mental perceptions are simply so many clues by which we can rise beyond mental perception, and if we use these fundamental idea symbols and arrangements to go beyond the symbol to that reality, then we have rightly used mind and the higher discernment for their supreme purpose. Mind and the higher discernment are satisfied of the Brahman even in being exceeded by him. So when we do it like this, our mind and our higher discernment has the full satisfaction of their purpose. Now recall again, it includes all our awareness, which includes, though not explicitly stated, as I said. And so as we turn in this way and we feel the closeness of the divine consciousness in our thoughts, in our heart, we feel that deep satisfaction of knowing him. Although we know this is not all of him, but in him, in this closeness, we make the first step from which he then lifts us into his intimacy, which is a supra-mental, supra-rational consciousness. Until then, this mental awareness can only receive as if in a reflection. So he says, the mind can only reflect in a sort of supreme understanding and experience the form, the image of the Supreme as he shows himself to our mentality. Through this reflection, we know the purpose of knowledge is accomplished, for we find immortality, we enter into the law, the being, the beatitude of the Brahman consciousness. So this first point of contact is almost felt as a reflection. The image of the Supreme as he shows himself to our mentality. How do we know that such a point exists, such a layer exists in which he reveals himself and our mentality can reach and know and receive him as a reflection? We could say all of this is a hope. But is there such a thing at all for the mind that the mind can touch, which is still the divine? And if we take a step back and look at the earlier picture, where we saw how the divine supports all cosmos and all form of beings through his active divinity. If the divine has to form and support every being and object, then a part of him has to lean down all the way to the most material. And so the part of him that leans down into our mental awareness is precisely that part which our mind now touches in its highest turn. There has to be something which links, otherwise the cosmos could not exist. But this is still a reflection. Why does he use the word reflection? Obviously, in the experience itself, the nature of the experience is one where we know the divine in reflection, not yet feeling the substance. As we rise beyond this, we begin to feel tangibly the divine as a substance, as a body into which we merge. But at first, it is a reflection. The light fills us. His joy fills us. And something within us turns and receives. But when we move and when we are disturbed, then very quickly the reflection breaks and the light and the joy begin to fade out. And so the image given traditionally is that of the surface of the lake. Why lake and not ocean? Because our consciousness is finite. So our consciousness is like this little lake in the universe. And our mind is like the waters of the lake, agitated. And the divine consciousness is everything above it. You can conceive of something far away as the sun, or you can conceive of everything else that the sun lights up all the way to the surface of the lake, which also the lake reflects. So, as the agitations of our consciousness become still, we are able to receive as in a reflection. But the reflection is not mere optical illusion. It is the real light of the Supreme which is reflecting into the lake. The reflection itself is the divine consciousness in that poise where it becomes mind and mental awareness. And so when we have this reflection, we must go beyond the limits of the analogy. We must know it is the divine himself and the tip of his finger, so to say, that is now settling. At this point of contact, Sri Aurobindo uses the term the intuitive consciousness, where the ray of the supramental sun, a single ray, finite, limited, and yet light of the Supreme and substance of the Supreme, comes down and can touch the highest peaks of our mental awareness if the mind is still. And that touch is our first contact with the supramental consciousness. Except that it is the supramental reduced to finite. And yet, in its quality, in its purity, in the truth of its light and substance, it is that. But the first requirement to be able to receive the intuition is to be able to make the mind silent at will. Because that's when you can receive the touch and the reflection. But go beyond the analogy. The reflection is not mere optical illusion. It is light and substance of the Supreme touching. Or we can push the analogy a little bit. The sun's light reflecting also enters the lake and warms up the waters. With what? With its heat, with its light. It reveals the depths of the lake. You look inside, not only you see the reflection of the sun, but you see also with its light what is happening inside the waters, and you see the fish moving. So if you push the analogy a little more, then you realize the exact same thing is happening in us as the touch of the divine fingertip reflects the image of the Supreme as he shows himself to our mentality. Through this reflection, we find, we know. So there are two degrees here. I have found, yes, there is this experience. And as that settles and becomes familiar, we have the sense, yes, I know, and it stays. The purpose of knowledge is accomplished, for we find immortality. And from there, the degrees of entry, we enter into the law, the being, the beatitude of the Brahman consciousness. And the rest of it, we have seen how, and this was part of the text earlier which we touched, through these figures, we can enter into, live in, and be one in law and being, and even merge oneself in the Brahman. So from that point of contact, the rest of the journey is largely driven by his consciousness drawing you more and more into himself, and you giving more and more of yourself. Sri Aurobindo explains how the passage or the process of surrender begins with an effort. You have to make an effort initially. But increasingly as the surrender grows and the divine Shakti takes charge and she begins to make the effort within you, the scope of your effort becomes less and less. Gradually yielding yourself entirely until she does the sadhana in you. But if you do not make that initial effort, then the rest of it cannot take place. And in the same way, one opens and gives oneself, she works. His power in you works and lifts you for the rest of the process. We enter into the law, the being, the beatitude of the Brahman consciousness. But remember, all this is happening where? Right here in this human consciousness. In our mind, which is still embodied. And as we enter more and more to begin to live in the Brahman consciousness, the working of our mind changes. And as the action of his consciousness settles in the rest of our being, all their working begins to change until they reflect more and more of his working, her working. And so we enter into the law, the being, and the beatitude of the Brahman consciousness, where here in life. The result of this is we have the experience of the divine higher existence here in what was earlier seen as the lower existence and a reflection of the higher. And so, by self-realization of Brahman as our self, we find the force, the divine energy, which lifts us beyond the limitation, weakness, darkness, sorrow, all pervading depths of our mortal existence. By the knowledge of the one Brahman in all beings and in all the various movements of the cosmos, we attain beyond these things to the infinite, the omnipotent being, the omniscient light, the pure beatitude of the divine existence. So now two different things he shows us. One which is subjectively within us, the other is in the objective experience outside us. And the totality of this is what makes for the divine life on earth. So the first, by self-realization of Brahman as our self, what happens? The force, the divine energy, lifts us beyond the limitations. This force and divine energy is the divine Shakti, is the divine mother, to whom we align ourselves consciously in the process of the integral yoga. Here in the vocabulary of the Kena Upanishad, the focus is given to the divine first, and his energy is therefore his means by which he lifts you. So this divine energy lifts us beyond all that was associated with the domain of Mrita, the inferior existence, death. From where we looked towards the domain of Amritam, the Satchidananda, and all of those possibilities now begin to work in us and lift us to be free of all this. And the list: limitation, weakness, darkness, sorrow, all pervading death of our mortal existence. And this is the change which takes place from within, and the self being to be Brahman. Now remember, there was the other side, which was the dwelling upon the working of the gods and that which is essential in the gods, to recognize that that is the divine working in the cosmos. And through that, by the knowledge of the one Brahman in all beings and in all the various movement of the cosmos, we are seeing the divine working in all the cosmos. We attain beyond these things to the infinite. To the infinity, the omnipotent being, the omniscient light, the pure beatitude of that divine existence, but now seen through the forms and the screen of the cosmic working. So such a person would look at the cosmos and see here the divine playing out his Leela through all the various forms and through all the various actors and agencies. But he would dwell upon the divine working in and through all these things. Experience, therefore, the infinity, the omnipotent being and omniscient light, the pure beatitude of the divine existence. And this would be the seeing of the universe, the body of God behind the appearance of the universe, the Satchidananda, manifested in form. So both within us is the liberation of the divine consciousness, and in our engagement with the universe, in the engagement with nature, nature herself is liberated into the divine nature. And this is an extraordinary achievement. So Sri Aurobindo says in the next paragraph, this great achievement must be done here in this mortal world, in this limited body. For if we do it, we arrive at our true existence and are no longer bound down to our phenomenal becoming. It is a great achievement. But it is also the achievement, the direction in which all nature is struggling through her mechanical evolution. But she cannot cross beyond the threshold. It is at that point that she creates this human entity formed out of herself, which can make that passage and link. And in the human being, the divine can reach down and form the link. And that's why, in a sense, the whole universe is waiting for the awakening of the divinity in humanity. But if here we find it not, great is the loss and perdition. For we remain continuously immersed in the phenomenal life of the mind and body and do not rise beyond it into the true supramental existence. If we were to think that somehow in the passage of death we would get to something higher, that is also an error, he says. Nor, if we miss it here, will death give it to us by our passage to another and less difficult world. Only those who use their awakened self and enlightened powers to distinguish and discover that one and immortal in all existences, the all-originating self, the all-inhabiting Lord, can make the real passage which transcends life and death, can pass out of this mortal status, can press beyond and rise upward into a world transcending immortality. So the transcending immortality, the Satchidananda which transcends, is not merely in a part of the cosmos on the higher planes, because then you're stuck with that part. The transcendence is when you can be in it on all the levels. And this is the direction evolution is pushing us. When we step out of the physical body in the transition of death, we are only continuing to live in the same consciousness on a different grade of the world. We do not have the immortality of the Satchidananda, but we do not have either the rigidity and resistance of the material world. So it's an easier world, but you cannot know the divine in its most material reality. So it is only when you know the Satchidananda behind everything in the cosmos, including matter and the appearances of matter, then you know the divine in its totality. And that is the world transcending immortality. And to this we have to go. Now, having completed this, when we reread the verses, you will see how Sri Aurobindo has elaborated and brought clarity in the sequence of the logic of each of these verses. So I will read all 5 verses of this second part of the Kena Upanishad. Verse 1, if you think that you know it well, little indeed do you know the form of the Brahman. That of it which is you, that of it which is in the gods, this you have to think out. I think it known. So this is the result of the first effort. Then immediately we have to make the correction. This is not all. I think not that I know it well, and yet I know that it is not unknown to me. He of us who knows it knows that. He knows that it is not unknown to him. So here is the point where we have the relationship and the closeness begun. Verse 3. He by whom it is not thought out has the thought of it. He by whom it is thought out knows it not. It is unknown to the discernment of those who discern of it. By those who seek not to discern of it, it is discerned. So at this point, one lets go of the mind's effort and allows the higher discernment and the higher possibility of cognition to grow out beyond the mind. When it, verse 4, when it is known by perception that reflects it, then one has the thought of it, for one finds immortality. By the self one finds the force to attain, and by the knowledge one finds immortality. So it is through this passage that the immortality, Amritam, the Satchidananda, is realized. And finally, verse 5 gives you the warning. If here being in this material world and material experience, if here one comes not to that knowledge, if here one comes to that knowledge, then one truly is. If here one comes not to the knowledge, then is the perdition. The wise distinguish that in all kinds of becomings, and they pass forward from this world and become immortal. Remember, this world is the state of consciousness of mortality, and we pass out of the mortality into the Amritam, the Satchidananda, and become immortal. When we distinguish that in all the becomings, including the most material. Such a being now, when he looks at the cosmos, sees not just of his physical world, but all the levels of reality at the same time. And all of these are the domain or the body of the Lord as revealed and manifested before him. And he therefore now participates in the play, the Leela, spanning all these levels of the cosmos, not just the physical world. And so this is the nature of the supramental experience of reality and of the divine. So there is a little more, and some of this which needs elaboration before we complete this paragraph, which we will take up then next Sunday. For now, we can dwell upon the immediate implication in our practice. And it points to what Sri Aurobindo has referred to as the fundamental realizations of the integral yoga. He speaks of three, but at the moment we dwell upon two of them. One is the awakening to the divine presence within us, and the other is the perception of the divine in all things. But he uses the vocabulary of the divine mother, the divine Shakti, as she works in all things, including within us. So recall the text as it says, to dwell on that of the divine which is you, and to dwell on that of the divine which is in the gods, that is in the cosmic workings. Who is working? The divine mother, mother of the gods. She works as the cosmic Shakti, as the cosmic power in everything. And within us, it is the divine consciousness who is the part of us that is the Lord. And so these are the two things we dwell upon, and you will see how it's possible to begin with one and move to the other, or even to hold both at the same time, in whatever way our mind is able to conceive of and perceive. So do not worry if in the process you make an effort with the mind to force, to imprint. Recall the discussion last time. What the mind begins initially by thinking of, dwelling upon, even imagining, forms as if a point of support in which the truth of the experience from the other side comes and touches, leans in, so to say, in your seeing and in your feeling. And very quickly then the mask of your mind's construction falls away and the experience begins to fill more and more directly. And you feel it becoming tangible and concrete. And then the heart, when it dwells, when it gives itself in a spontaneous self-surrender, and especially when it gives itself in joy, then the whole thing acquires a rapidity and a intensity and depth which brings deep fulfillment, in which we feel the intimacy of the divine close, and which then makes everything else appear miraculous, and beautiful. The whole world becomes as if a domain of joy, of magic, of beauty, which is beyond the human conception of the senses. And this experience fills us in all four facets which the Kena Upanishad touches through the mind's awareness, through our life being, through our senses, and through the inspiration that works in us, in our speech, or in our actions or thoughts. And so, this you will find as the very basic, central, but all encompassing practice at the core of the integral yoga. We can meditate on this for a while, and we can use this as a preparation also for the coming special occasion of Sri Aurobindo's birthday and the darshan. If we align ourselves thus to his consciousness and to the working of the mother in us, then we will find the day will have that magical feel, and he can give to us easily many of the gifts of the higher darshan, of the divine.